Okay, let's bring on our next guest. We are going to be having Liam O'Mara. Justin, I think that was a thrilling conversation with Lorena. I think she really brings into the fold a lot of the subjects around identity very well. I think that is
Yes.
an important part about how you inspire people, and even it causes a beneficial effect in just mental health for a lot of people. So I'm looking forward to learning what Liam brings to the table here. With that being said, let's bring on Liam. Hey, Liam, how you doing, man?
Hi.
Pretty well.
It's great to be able to talk with you again. We've been having this day-long event so far, really focusing on the idea of how we improve government to make it more representative, to make it more efficient, and most importantly, make it more trustworthy. And so I think the first place to start, as we've done with all of our guests so far, is take it personally. You are a candidate. You are currently running. You're getting ready for a general election. And so I would like to have just a little retrospective with you. During your primary campaign, what were some of the hurdles that you ran into that was because of our democratic process that you think needs to be alleviated for future candidates that run?
Well, I think one of the obvious ones that we run into is the funding issues.
Yeah.
Because campaigns have gotten absurdly expensive, and that has led more and more people to take that dirty money. And then, of course, you owe favors to all the people that you took money from. And the only people that I want to owe are the voters. So that definitely got difficult. Another one that I ran into very specifically in my area was the difficulty of raising the profile of the district at all. I mean, people just don't care much about it. The current the incumbent is basically a ghost. People never heard of him for the most part. And it's then hard to get attention of people across the country. Oh, we got to get rid of people have all heard of Steve King. You can cheer getting rid of Steve King, but who the hell's heard of Ken Calvert? 28 years, he's never chaired a committee. So it's difficult to then show that. And then one of the really big challenges that I think that a lot of districts in this country are actually going to face, and this has a lot to do, I think, too, with some changes in democratic politics specifically, is our retreat from more rural districts and from a willingness to really engage with people and talk about the things that really matter to them and to put our solutions into language that makes sense to them. So there's just not a lot of infrastructure for that. There's not a lot of practice for it. The big organizations and outside donors are not used to thinking in terms of doing that. So really, they're like, well, if it's not going to work in a big city, then we don't care, I'm like, okay, now what?
Yeah, I certainly can see that being a big barrier. It is hard to kind of kill these ghosts. We don't have our Dan Aykroyds and Bill Murrays out there in the field always to be able to bust them up. But, I'm curious, in your opinion, touching on that campaign finance point, what has been your stance on this kind of big divide that's been happening in the Democratic Party as a whole? Frankly, you have your more moderate Democrats who say that we need to be using every weapon in the toolbox to maintain competitiveness. And then you have more progressive leaning Democrats who say we can't be taking corporate PAC money. We can't be taking big bundled money from these special interest groups because then we become beholden to them. What do you think is the proper way for us to be able to lead reform and be able to topple some of these incumbents? I know for yourself, you're not running against a Democrat anymore, but in general, what do you think is that approach for fundraising?
Well, on the one hand, you can kind of see where people are coming from in terms of like, oh, no litmus tests or whatever. We should just judge them on their character and their policies or whatever. And so what if they took some money from Chevron? The problem is, as soon as you take that money, you're beholden to them. That's how that works. They're buying influence. And we like to pretend that it isn't the same situation. It's not the same system we had in the 19th century where you could walk in with an envelope stuffed full of cash and buy Congress critters, but you absolutely still can. And as soon as you take that money, you owe them. Because if you turn your back on it, they burn you. They spend money on your trying to get rid of you next time around. So what was the point? What did you get in to do in the first place? If you can get in on clean money, there's no one out there willing to dump $10 million into your opponent's coffers to get rid of you because they feel they got screwed. The trick there is don't screw them. Well, then a lot of the Democrats who take that money, well, they're not. They're not going to screw those people. They're going to keep doing what they want to do. So Yeah, I have a pretty hard position on influence there. As far as I'm concerned, lobbying should mean coming to someone and expressing your opinion on something. That's what it was supposed to be. You're showing up there and saying, "Hi, I want to be heard." Right? That should be it.
That should be it. So, Justin, want to ask a couple questions?
Yeah. Well, as someone who lives in the district right next to yours, Liam, I'm really vested in your campaign, and I've been paying attention to your tweets, and we've talked a bit several times on Twitter. So, like a big part of what I want to ask is, now that you finished the primaries and are moving on to the general election, what have you learned, or how have you like evolved in this process? Like, what are some of the lessons that you want to give to future candidates that are in your position, that were in your position? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of the lessons that I learned specifically wouldn't really translate well in terms of advice to other people per se. They have a lot more to do with how you structure teams, what priorities you set, what goals you go after first. Some of those things were very specific to, mistakes that I had made along the way. I was happy enough with the way the primary turned out. I was disappointed that someone with the other Democrats' views did as well. But that really comes down to some of the ideas used in that campaign, that a lot of times people will just go with whatever's advertised to them. And I put a lot more into meeting people directly and, speaking to as many people as I could, and that word of mouth, instead of dumping a bunch of cash into advertising to people and mass mailers and whatnot. And those do make a difference, sadly. I've often struggled with this personally, just because a lot of the techniques that they use in the advertising industry sort of fly over my head. For one thing, I try to avoid a lot of television too. A lot of the tricks that they're using, like I've always wondered, like, okay, you're putting out a sign for a campaign and it's just a person's name. Why does that matter? Like, who goes in and says, "Oh, I've heard of this person," but people do, and there are actual studies of that. And the more you do of that, the better. But the trick there too is you still have to balance the priorities. You still have to figure out where the best places to spend money are. And that's especially true on the clean money campaigns. But I definitely would have invested a bit more into some of the advertising, some of the basic name recognition stuff. I would have gotten a lot more signs and a lot larger signs much earlier, for example.
Yeah.
Sad as that is, but there are studies showing that they do work.
Well, I'm happy that you brought up those studies, and I think getting your name out there is a large part of the uphill battle that progressive candidates usually face, because we are basing our campaigns around grassroots, and we don't have as much of a deep pockets as some of those corporate establishment candidates do. With that being said, I do have another question for you. Since I'm a really young person, and you're a history teacher, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, professor, but yeah.
All right. Oh, well, sorry, you're a history professor.
No, it's fine. It's a small distinction for a lot do teach, but we use the words differently. So. All
right. Okay. Well, Professor Liam, I know. We know that in election cycles, the youth tend to get ignored in like the politics, and since you are a history professor yourself, I want to know what your perspective on our education system is. A lot of the other candidates that we interviewed have alluded to the fact that we need to teach kids more social studies and how to participate in our democracy. What are your thoughts on the process?
Well, civics has really been downplayed in a lot of high schools for a long time. It doesn't have the same kind of position that it used to. That said, a lot of civics education, as well as like history/social studies, used to be much more transparently propagandistic. than they've gotten. Some of our history texts they use in high schools have definitely gotten better than they used to. I mean, we didn't have any kind of like genuine recognition of genocide towards native populations in the textbooks that I had growing up. So that's nice, but it does get to something of a difference between, since we had the little laugh about the job role, right? A lot of early education, your primary and secondary education, is essentially indoctrination into the basic myths and skills that you need to function in society. It's not really trying to teach a lot of critical thinking. That's not really its purpose. It's trying to teach you how to count and how to read and what basically to do. And by the time you get into university, our job is kind of like to break through some of that, because you're trying to produce more the original thinkers, the leaders of tomorrow. So you've got to get them away from that sort of like indoctrination. But there is a real value, I think, in teaching things like critical reasoning and logic and whatnot, as well as civics and history, philosophy, literature, whatnot, in earlier education. And the earlier that's done, the better people are off throughout their lives. If they learn to read the news critically very young, because they learned how to read critically in the first place. And because we have emphasized so much teaching to standardized tests in order to get funding into the schools, honestly, the whole thing is just bullshit today. You're teaching people to fill in a little bubble test that's going to do them no good the rest of their lives, and you're not giving them the useful skills that would help them to thrive in a republic. And a republic, for this kind of government to survive, it requires an informed citizenry. It demands it. So the less skill you're imparting early on in those areas, the more it really hurts.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Justin's question, kind of focusing on your profession as a history professor. You know, Justin and I are both on the younger end. Justin's a little bit younger than I am. But I wanted to kind of hear in your perspective, I'm going to guess maybe there's like a 20 to 30 age gap maybe between us, Liam. I'm just guessing here, maybe. And so I wanted to find out, in your opinion.
I turned 46, so...
Okay, 20. So I'm right with 20. 20 is about right.
Really young.
Yeah, so it's a 20-year gap. So in the past 20 years, do you think that our government has become more or less representative of the people, or is it the same?
No, it's become considerably less so in some ways. That said, you do have to take like the longer view of this.
Yeah.
In the first 50 years of this country, 5% of the people could vote. You know, we've definitely gotten better there. I mean, it wasn't until 1919 we passed the amendment for women's suffrage, and then 1922 was gave citizenship to Native Americans. I mean, there's just like a huge delay before whole classes of people start coming in. You know, non-property owners, Black people, and women, then natives.
Yeah.
It took a long time. And all the way through into the 60s, you still had tons of like Jim Crow laws. You know, you used to be able to like, John, in order to vote, please spell cat. Okay, cool. Justin,
K-A-T.
Please spell anti-disestablishmentarianism. Sorry, Justin can't vote. I just really arbitrary stuff.
Yeah.
We were getting better. We were on the right track. In more recent decades, it's gone away from us in two different ways. One is more and more right-wing courts have been undoing a lot of decisions that helped before. And the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act, that really hurt. Things like the campaign finance issues, the Citizens United decision really hurt. But honestly, a lot of that problem was already there to begin with. They just made it much worse. And the more of that corruption that comes in, and the more, I mean, I hate even to use the word conservative now for a lot of these movements here, but the more so-called conservative justices you get in, the less representative it gets, because there's no actual commitment to democracy. I mean, the philosophy is actually predicated on tradition and authoritarianism. It cares about its views, not yours.
Yeah.
So we're definitely in the wrong direction.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask, you know, education system is only one way we inform ourselves as a populace. The other major system that we inform ourselves with to know what is happening in media, and you even alluded to this, we need to build up our critical thinking skills to properly evaluate this, is the media. That is a major source of information, specifically around politics of the day. How, in your opinion, do we need to be shaping the media from a federal level to better inform the public, or to just make sure that it's more fair even just on the local levels?
It honestly is a much more complex question than I think we're willing to look at. I mean, because on the one hand, the U.S. has among the freest presses in the world because of the lack of direct government censorship. The First Amendment really matters, and the way it had been interpreted for 200 years really matters. On the other hand, we are the most heavily propagandized population in the developed world, largely because we have an almost entirely corporate media. And we've allowed massive concentration in power there, such that like 80% of all media consumed comes out of 5 corporations. I mean, there was a what was his name? Ben Bagdikian, I think. He released several versions of a book. He kept like releasing an update every few years, talking about the gradually shrinking number of companies owning things. I mean, media monopolies are a real problem. And simple fact is, if your corporation exists to make a profit, then you're going to allow your content to be shaped by those interests. Yeah. And if the media is connected to other industries as well, it's sort of like, okay, so I'll pull fun examples out of my profession. Al Jazeera is a decent news source for a lot of parts of the Arab world, but it is absolute crap if you want to know what's going on in Qatar, because it's connected to the ruling family in the country. I mean, there's an interest that overlaps there, right? Yeah. So if your media branch is connected to a branch that also makes this problematic product that's cranking out tons of toxic waste, you're probably not going to mention it very often.
Yeah, it reminds me of that dynamic that the police are kind of undergoing currently with who investigates them. It's usually the DA who's reliant on the police to give them the cases and work with them. You have to have some level of separation of interest. So I do largely agree with you there. I guess my final question that I wanted to ask before I pass it back to Justin is, on the subject of, frankly, taxation and budgeting. Frankly, this question gets asked a lot in the framing of what taxes do you want and what do you want to use the budget on? But I wanted to understand, in your opinion, what you think needs to change in the general process of budgeting. There are different measures that have been discussed this past year, some of which, frankly, more often than not are negative, like PayGo, which was the big thing that Nancy Pelosi was trying to lead in the House. What, in your opinion, could be done to make the process of budgeting and putting on new taxations more efficient and more representative of the needs of the public?
I'm going to... Yeah, I don't know that I can give you a happy answer to that at all. There's I'm not good at those, and it's one of the things you love in politics. Everyone wants a nice happy answer. Oh, this is what you do. Perfect, do it. The system is too corrupt at this point, and it's too partisan. It's too tribal. Everyone's going to fight over every last little line item, and a lot of the things that they're putting into the budgets are only because of the particular owners that put them in the first place. We're not actually going to get budgets that reflect the interests of the population until you get the money out. And realistically, until you replace a lot of the people that are currently in there. I mean, our budgets are broken by design. It's intentional. A lot of the problems that we deal with are intentional. And people keep fighting over them as if there's a way to solve them. There's no way to solve something like, I don't know, immigration is a fun one that comes up a lot in my district there. There's no way to solve it as long as it's being intentionally manufactured as a problem for partisan interests. I mean, the budget is another one. It's one that both parties like to fight over, neither want to actually reform, and both have an interest in the gridlock that we currently have.
That's very true. Frankly, we always weaponize your over deficit spending only when you're out of power, because that's just the cudgel to stop progress on the issues of the in power group. Justin,
tons and tons of about Obama deficit, Obama doubled the debt, and Trump's spending shot up like immediately shot up month to month, and he's run higher deficits every single year, and nothing from the right, just nothing. Whatever, and that'll change, right? As soon as they're out of power again, it'll flip around. Both sides do it. It's and really they're doing it because of the system. And I do like to emphasize at least. It's more the systems than the people. It constrains you. It locks you into it, and you fall into that partisan logic, which in a way gets back to that first question about campaign finance. As soon as you buy into that system, you're corrupted by it, and it doesn't matter what your actual beliefs are, what your ideals are. You're going to be dragged down into it.
Justin, do you have any follow-up questions you wanted to ask?
Yes, I do. So, I really like your answer about how this once you fall in line with those partisan ideas, you sort of get corrupted in the belly of the beast. So I want to ask, what are some incentives that you could think of that would incentivize politicians to vote for things such as campaign reforms that might hurt their own campaigns? I would like to hear your opinion on and thoughts on this. Sorry.
Yeah, there's really only one bit of leverage that you've got, and that's mass mobilization. I mean, we have to, on some level, connect street politics to electoral politics. You have to make the issue important enough, and that means more people have to understand that it's the center of a spider web of corruption dragging everything down. A lot of people end up like, oh yeah, Congress has an approval rating of 7%, blah, blah, blah. No one likes it. Like, well, why do you think that it's like that? Why do you think it can't get anything done? It's all the dirty money, right? It didn't used to function this badly. So we have to make it a much more visceral issue for a lot more people. But the other one, it also touches back on the campaign finance issue too, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to have to replace plenty of people as well, and certainly a lot of people on the right. I mean, otherwise, nothing is going to get done. There's nothing that's really going to incentivize them to do that because they don't have a reason to care. They just don't. Until enough voters care, they won't at all. And along the way of getting more voters to care, you can also get more people involved. And we often can feel a bit helpless, especially when you're looking at millions of dollars being spent by these different companies, and they've got the deep pockets. They can throw this. What can I do? What can I do? It's the same basic logic you run into with like, well, why my vote doesn't matter. My one vote doesn't matter. Well, they often really do.
Yeah,
But yeah, exactly. That's the thing. And I'll make the argument. Okay, so how many people go to like Starbucks regularly, right? They go get a cup of coffee, right? What if you gave the price of a cup of coffee a month? Right? Or if you're a little better off, the price of a cup of coffee a week, like one coffee a week to a candidate. That doesn't seem like much, right? $5, whatever, $3, $4. I mean, it's not a huge amount of money, but if enough people do it consistently, if you got a few thousand people to give the price of a Starbucks a month, you can run a credible campaign.
So I got this one question from the chat, Liam, that I think is a very interesting question. We've been talking a lot today about how it's mainly been like the Democratic Party that has been kind of pushing a lot of these initiatives forward in terms of democracy reform. We've seen the For the People Act pass through the House. We saw it get obstructed in the Senate. In your opinion, what do you think in terms of working with conservatives could we potentially push forward in terms of democracy reform? What are some of the things? You're in a district that is largely purple. What has been some topics in general that you've heard from them? There's clearly some anti-corruption sentiments, like Trump won on the idea of draining the swamp, even if he didn't do it. What do you think you've heard from them that they might be willing to adopt?
Yeah, I mention things like that a lot too. The draining the swamp. I mean, and I'll often flip that back around. You want to take it seriously? I mean, our incumbent here in this district is that swamp.
Yeah,
that. But it's difficult because you can often get a lot of interest. I mean, anti-corruption is a bipartisan issue. People care about it, but they often care about a few things more. So again, we have to make it more real. So that it's the same kind of logic that applies on both sides there. You have to help them to understand just how badly this hurts us. Yeah. And if you can make it into a bipartisan issue too with them, like, okay, so here I'm gonna be bagging on Ken Calvert or whatever, my incumbent for corruption here. Point out that plenty of Democrats are doing it too. Yeah. Right, that that it's a bipartisan issue, and if some of the people that you don't like in there are dependent upon that money, you're going to hurt them in the process. There's because it really, again, the Democrats are much better on this issue, but anyway, I think you hit on the single biggest one with the corruption issue itself mattering. Another good one that I like to point to is a sense of personal responsibility or accountability, which comes a lot in conservative rhetoric, but then frequently when the rubber hits the road, they don't care. They're willing to blow that off.
Yeah.
You end up with massive hypocrisy in it. So trying to come back to that and show, look, accountability matters. If we do something wrong, we should be prosecuted for it. We should lose our jobs for whatever. Be accountable to people and be accountable to voters as well, which is another thing that really hits in my district as well, since my incumbent just so seldom does any kind of public appearances, town halls, doesn't answer social media questions. He was supposed to show up on one of these like Zoom-based type town halls recently.
Yeah.
And of course he didn't. Right. I'm personally, I'm convinced that he was never intending to do so, but he was announced as part of it. So of course I tuned in to see. I mean, he doesn't feel accountable. To him, the voters don't really matter. And conservatives care about that too. And if you tell them, look, we're not going to agree on every issue, but I'm going to sit down with you across the table and we're going to talk about it. And I'm going to explain my position. You can explain yours. I'm going to hear your concerns. And we'll see if we can make sense of this. Where he doesn't care. And a lot of the people in DC, they don't care.
Yeah. Well, Justin, do you have a final question for Liam as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I actually do have a final question. So, Liam, I understand that you said that mass mobilization is one of the avenues for us to push for those policies. But once you get into office with mass mobilization, you're going to, on your website, you say that you want a basic income. You said you want universal health care, but you're going to face oppositions from your opposition that says, how are you going to fund those things? What taxes are you going to use? Is it a value-added tax? Is it a wealth tax? Or how about the budgeting? Wouldn't that just add to the deficit of our country? How would you respond to those questions?
There's probably no possible way to answer that in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I know.
There are a lot of pieces to that. The simple answer is anybody who tells you that they know everything about how something like a UBI is going to be funded is lying. We don't know. There are too many interesting questions there, especially when I'm not in favor of rolling back large parts of the existing social welfare safety net at the same time. That was one of the downsides I saw to Yang's approach to it, because the goal for me is to completely eliminate poverty and to give more people a leg up to do well. So I would want to be able to maintain a higher level of support for them for a while until they don't need it anymore. So you're going to end up with a more complicated funding mechanism there. But the single biggest thing I can point to that would make the single biggest difference, and I can hit in 1 minute, would be our tax system is currently screwed up, like massively screwed up. The wealthy do not pay their taxes and corporations do not pay their taxes. All right. And we should stop, excuse my French, we should stop fucking around with this. Right. So it's like, let's incentivize them to bring their money back. Maybe they'll please bring their money back. No, like you say, you bring your money back right now and you pay your damn taxes or you don't do business in this country anymore.
Yeah.
Our consumer still matters. It still matters. Eventually it won't. There'll be enough consumer markets in the developing world that they don't need it here. But our 320 million people still really matter. Right. So if they want to do business in the US, then they pay their damn taxes and they pay a fair share of their taxes. And the rich, the incentives are all off. Investment has been falling overall in society because they aren't paying high taxes. They have an incentive to just drop that cash in the Caymans.
Yeah.
I'd put the taxes back at least where they were under Johnson.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I love the approach because, frankly, we have this rule already in the United States where if you're a citizen, if you are living abroad and you still have your U.S. citizenship, you pay your taxes anyway.
Mhm.
Companies, if you're doing business here, you're doing the majority of your business here, you're not paying your taxes because you're somewhere else based in the world when you don't do much business there anyway. You pay taxes, you're not doing business here. I think that's a very straightforward.
Because you know what? We don't have lobbyists. The poor don't have lobbyists. Ordinary people have lobbyists. Amazon has lobbyists. And again, it gets back to the dirty money issue. Everything ultimately comes back to that for me.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Liam, thank you so much for taking the time to answer Justin and I, as well as our chat's questions. We really appreciate you being on today, and we look forward to continue building this relationship going forward and helping you in the fall. Can you let the folks out there know if they liked what you had to say today, how they could support your campaign?
Yeah, my website is liamomara.org, liamomara.org. It has volunteering and donate links right up the top there. The donate just takes you to ActBlue, easy to set up there. The volunteer, there's a form to fill in. We do phone banks all the time here, and you can help out with that literally anywhere in the country. It's easy to do. So those are the easiest things to do. And then I'm super active on social media. Just searching for Liam O'Mara, you're going to run into me.
Well, Liam, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. As always, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.